Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Data Standard Auto Experience. I'm your host, Catherine Tao, and today on our show we have Ihsan Saracgil, the Principal Data Scientist at Visible Alpha. And today we're speaking more about advice for PhD students in investment research. So welcome to the show, Ihsan. I'm so excited to have you today.
Well, pleasure being here. My name is Ihsan, and yes, I'm the Principal Data Scientist at Visible Alpha. It's a fintech firm. I joined the firm 3.5 years ago as the first data scientist. I was brought on to provide a data scientist perspective and toolkit on a wide array of projects. So I've been working on as an individual contributor in a lot of these projects, but as of late, I'm also focusing on building a data science team, culture, and practice at Visible Alpha also. So now I have a small but mighty team and looking to recruit. Again, it's a growing company. So before all this, I did a PhD in economics at the University of Michigan. I started my PhD around 2009, right after the financial crisis. So, obviously my dissertation had to look at financial subjects like banking regulations, high leverage investments, and so on. So when I left academia for private sector, I got more drawn into data science. And when the opportunity at Visible Alpha came up it's an intersection of investment research with a data science toolkit, it was a great match and it's been a good ride ever since.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And you had also brought up the term investment research, and that's going to be a big part of what we're going to be speaking about today in the podcast. So in your own words, how would you describe what investment research is?
Sure. So to describe investment research, let me divide the investment world into two main players. Okay, so there's the buy side and there's the sell side. So let's start with the buy side. So all these terms that you hear in the press, hedge funds, asset managers, quant traders. So these are all institutional investors who buy stocks in large quantities. So if you're an investment professional in one of these buy side firms, you would spend your time thinking about, which stocks am I going to invest in, by how much and why. So let's talk about the sell side now. So sell side is typically the banks who provide research services on these stocks and trying to help the buy side navigate investment decisions. I mean, obviously they do a lot of other things like investment banking and brokerage and so on and so forth. But, research is an important service that they provide. So if you're a sell side analyst, you would research these stocks in great detail. You would try to understand their business model, figure out what are the key drivers of these firms and industries, and you would actively forecast them. And then you would put these forecasts into some model that you would circulate with the buy-side clients. That model is not a statistical model as we data scientists tend to understand what a model is. These are financial models. Typically, it's some massive spreadsheet that, if you would see one, that would make any data scientist run for the nearest exit. Well, where it gets interesting at Visible Alpha is that, imagine we ingest millions of such models from thousands of analysts on thousands of firms globally. Then it leads to a very rich data set that if you're a data scientist in this area, you can ask investment research questions at an unprecedented scale. So hopefully this sort of, set the stage for what we're doing and what is investment research and what is exciting about it to be a data scientist in this field.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like there's a lot of different things that you have to do in investment research, and a lot of it is data science. And can you share some examples of data science projects that you have been working on?
Yeah, definitely. Let me give you this one example that I've been working on for about a year, and this actually evolved into a product feature that's released recently. So we have forecast data on thousands of stocks. So let's say, how can I figure out which companies or stocks are peers to one another that I should compare against each other? Right? It seems like a very basic thing. And obviously, there's sector industry classifications, but they're quite broad. And typically one company would do multiple businesses, and that would make them appear in one group in one context and another group in another context. Think about Apple. Apple sells iPhones, which make it appear to Samsung, but they also have a music streaming, which competes with Spotify. And now they have Apple TV, which competes with Netflix, competes with AT&T, which is a telecommunications firm who happens to own HBO, which does streaming, right? So you got my point. I mean, it is a pretty difficult thing to answer. So what I did with this, trying to, solve these kind of issues, is we modeled this as a graph. So imagine I build a graph where the nodes in this graph are the companies, and these companies make edges with one another if they share an analyst that covers them both, or if they report similar KPIs, right? So the edges will carry bigger weights if they're covered by apply more analysts together. So I'm going to have strong edges, weak edges, or no edges at all. So if you take this sort of graph and try to even plot a tiny fraction of it, you would have so many overlapping connections between companies that it's impossible to figure out just looking at it. Where do you draw the boundary of a peer group? Right. So this is where I applied a community detection algorithm. It's a part of unsupervised learning, which is designed to find clusters on a graph. I'm not going to bore you with all the details. I end up using something called a LOVAM method. I'll just give you the fun details about it. It's actually named after a city where there's a university in Belgium, and the researchers who come up with this method, they all were working there. So it's named after that. And it has been applied to a huge array of problems. Like I've seen neuroscientists looking at MRI scans of the brain and use this method to find clusters in human brain that lights up when they subject to some stimuli, right? So we basically applied the same approach to this investable stock graph and put every stock into a community and a sub-community. So you would have, you have some companies that you're brothers and sisters, but you also have some cousins right next to you and some distant cousins and what have you. So how does it all turn into a product? So imagine that, there's some buy-side professional on Visible Alpha platform. They're looking at Apple's music streaming estimates. So now with like one click, I can actually search for who are Apple's closest peers who reports a similar comparable estimate. And I can chart it for you. If you think about it, just 5 years ago, this would be someone's afternoon to figure out who are the peers of Apple, look for the data. Do they have music streaming? Yes or no? Fetch the data, put it together to throw that chart. Now we're down to one click thanks to all this like data science magic.
Yeah, definitely. And so interesting to hear all of this from your perspective, and a very data science heavy and a lot of different things that you need to think about when working on these projects. And why would someone in the next generation want to go into this field? Like, what is your favorite part about this field?
So I'm going to go back to something I said earlier in the conversation. I think with, all this latest technology in, data processing, NLP, storage and all, like we managed to create data sets in the investment industry that were just unimaginable a decade ago. And like, I'm going to quote Sherlock Holmes, it's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. And now we have a lot more data. So the industry is sort of like off to the races. It used to be the case that there was like a very narrow section of the investment world, like colloquially called as the quants, who would invest in the data infrastructure and scientists, to create an edge for themselves. Nowadays, every corner of the investment world is rethinking, how they approach research. They're investing in data governance, acquisition, engineering, and scientists to analyze it. So lots of interesting roles opening up left and right from firms, small and large. I would say today, data scientists still have a bit of a support role in the buy side. You would still end up working for like a portfolio manager and investment officer. On the sell side, I don't know a lot of directors of research who are, data scientists, but my bet is that before too long, some of us will get to those key levels and open up a new world of possibilities in this industry and become role models for the next generation. There's a lot of unsolved problems in this area. So generally, to me, that's a great indication of a great place to be as for an aspiring data scientist. So, obviously, as an economist, I can give you a contrarian opinion. With the proverbial on the other hand, there are also projections out there that, data science is going to become like more automated with like auto ML. And there's, you hear these sensational headlines about AI driven automated investment funds and so on. I have a sense that the industry is still at its infancy and it will take a lot of time for it to mature, for any of these, dismal projections to become reality. I think I'm a part of something called Alternative Data Council, a working group under FIST, is an industry body where we sit down with data scientists and engineers from the investment community. And, we when we sit down together, we end up talking about the most mundane things, such as what is the basic data documentation you should get when you acquire some investment research data set. So we're at that level still. I think there's plenty of reasons to be excited about.
Absolutely, especially with things that are just constantly changing in the technology field. There's a lot that's happening, and it's interesting how much data science will be using and the next generation will be using as well. And, how can a PhD student better prepare themselves for this industry? And what final advice do you have for these PhD students?
So if you don't mind, I'm going to sort of limit my conversation to maybe economists, finance, accounting, the fields that I'm a bit more familiar with. So it is pretty interesting to maybe to your audience who may not be from, getting PhDs in these fields. Yeah, they might think that, look, these are very practical fields and they would have a lot of connections to the private sector, like the investment industry and finance and so on. To a lot of people's surprise, actually, that's not quite the case. Like a lot of people, like myself included, when we were PhD students, we were very much groomed to think of academia and maybe government as our most sort of prospective areas. And the idea of that you can be a data scientist in investment research and finance was a bit like a pipe dream. You didn't even know that such a thing typically would exist. Obviously there are some firms who come to the job market and hire PhD students, but it's not a lot. So my suggestion would be for new PhD students who are thinking about the job market in their, third, fourth, fifth, whatever year, is that you should be talking to the alumni. You should, start to broaden your horizons a little bit to all these opportunities that are out there, and that you're not limited to, just few options. Don't be discouraged by the weird fact that, a lot of these firms do not directly hire from the PhD market. It's perfectly normal to start your career in an industry. Like I started as a consultant. A lot of people would go into places like, consulting, tech, and what have you, and then use that in a way as a stepping stone to lots of other opportunities, including, the hedge fund industry or the investment research in general. I think the fact that if someone is listening to this podcast, they're already way, way ahead of me when I was a PhD student. I discovered a lot of these things along the way. That would be my best advice. Broaden your horizons before you hit the job market.
Yeah, and I think that's great advice, especially when you mentioned connecting with past alumni. They're great at giving advice of what you want to do later down in the road, just because they're currently in that role right now. And I think that's great advice. And that's something that I think not enough people take advantage of, or they try to strive for, to look for alumni to connect with. And that's super important, is the networking aspect there.
I absolutely didn't do it, and I regret it. I would
Yeah.
give people the advice that do it liberally. You would be surprised how thrilled people would be to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And people are often very willing to help past alumni. And I think that was a great piece of advice to give these students. And I want to say thank you so much, Ihsan, for joining me today on the Data Standard. We're building a community of data enthusiasts and data thought leaders to come together just so that they can be able to network and collaborate with each other. So what's something that we can do for you?
Definitely, I think like networking opportunities and collaboration are the areas where we look for most, because you can imagine as someone working at still a bit like a startup environment, we look into what others are doing all the time and trying to learn from them. That's the big area that, I always find it very useful from these communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll make sure to connect you with other people within our community. Where can everyone find you online to connect with you?
So my LinkedIn is generally up to date and is the social media that I use the most. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of social media presence in other places. So I would recommend maybe you can reach out directly to Visible Alpha and find me through there, or LinkedIn is a good place to do it.
Yeah, perfect. And for more information on the Data Standard, you can find us at www.datastandard.io, as well as on our LinkedIn and YouTube channel. And thank you so much, Ihsan, for joining me today. It was so great to have you on the show and hear more about your experiences and advice to PhD students. So thank you so much.
Pleasure being here.